He was never the kind of man you'd notice. Gary Leon Ridgway walked quietly through life, soft-spoken, average-looking, a man who kept to himself. He worked on trucks, paid his bills, and smiled at neighbors. To the world, he was just another man trying to make a living in the Pacific Northwest. But inside Gary Ridgway lived something sinister, a predator, a compulsive killer, and for over 2 decades, he hid behind a mask of normalcy while committing crimes so horrific they would haunt Washington state and the entire nation for generations. Gary was born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. From an early age, something about him seemed off. He struggled in school, was held back a grade, and often got into trouble. But what disturbed his peers the most wasn't his grades, it was his behavior. Gary once led a young boy into the woods and stabbed him. Coldly, without reason. The boy survived, but that moment offered a fleeting glimpse into the darkness forming inside Gary. At home, life wasn't much better. His relationship with his mother was strained, twisted, even. She was overbearing, dominating. When Gary wet the bed, something he did well into his teens, she would scrub him down naked, sometimes while criticizing or belittling him. These acts planted the earliest seeds of anger, confusion, and shame. It's a pattern seen in many serial killers, a cocktail of emotional neglect, humiliation, and a fractured identity. But in Gary's case, it festered quietly for years before exploding. By the early 1980s, the nightmare began. Women, many of them sex workers and runaways, started vanishing around Seattle, especially near Highway 99. One body was found, then another, dumped like trash in rivers, ravines, and dense woods. Some were posed, others were stripped of their clothing. All of them had been strangled. Panic gripped the community. Whispers of a serial killer began spreading. The press called him the Green River Killer, named after one of the first dump sites. Investigators were overwhelmed. The killer was methodical, careful. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, no motives, just corpses, dozens of them accumulating in the shadows. What nobody knew was that Gary Ridgway was living his life as if nothing had changed. He continued working at the Kenworth truck plant. He went to barbecues. He married again. He even passed a polygraph when questioned by police. It was the perfect mask, an unremarkable man living an ordinary life while secretly committing unspeakable acts. Behind closed doors, Gary developed a twisted routine. He would cruise red light districts at night, looking for vulnerable women. He'd offer them money, drive them to secluded areas, and then without hesitation strangle them, often with a belt or his bare hands. Sometimes he killed them in the woods, sometimes in the back of his truck, and sometimes in his own home. Then came the most haunting detail: he would return to the bodies, days later, sometimes weeks, to violate them, to pose them, to relive the moment of death. To Gary Ridgway, these women weren't human. They were objects, tools for satisfying a monstrous desire. Years passed, then decades. Over 40 women had been killed by 1990. And still, Gary remained free. Investigators were desperate. They even brought in Ted Bundy, America's most infamous serial killer, to consult on the case. Bundy, chillingly, was correct when he said the killer was someone who felt invisible, someone who returned to the bodies, someone who didn't stand out. And Bundy was right, because Ridgway was the very definition of invisible evil. But eventually, science caught up. In 2001, detectives re-examined evidence using updated DNA technology. A small trace of semen collected from some early victims finally gave them the break they had been praying for. The DNA matched Gary Ridgway, who had already been interviewed, who had already passed a lie detector, who had been hiding in plain sight. When police came for him, he didn't run, he didn't fight, he simply said okay, as if being unmasked as a killer was just another item on his to-do list. But what followed next would leave even seasoned detectives shaken. Gary Ridgway sat in an interrogation room for hours, then days. Over the course of 188 hours of interviews, he confessed to the murders with chilling detachment. There was no remorse, no regret, just cold, flat descriptions of how he lured his victims, how he strangled them, and how he disposed of their bodies. He admitted to killing 71 women. Most of their names had long been forgotten. Most had been discarded by society before Gary ever laid hands on them. That's why he chose them. He believed no one would care if they were gone. He confessed to keeping trophies, earrings, clothing, IDs. He remembered specific women, not by name, but by where he left their bodies. The one by the log, he'd say, or the one near the airport. It wasn't murder to him, it was ritual. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway made a deal. In exchange for his cooperation helping police recover bodies, leading them to burial sites, he would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2003, he was convicted of 48 murders. Years later, that number would rise to over 70. The final count? No one truly knows. Today, Gary Ridgway lives out his days in the Washington State Penitentiary. A caged predator, a man who once hunted freely now stalks only the walls of his cell. But for the families of his victims, the pain never fades. They live with memories of daughters, sisters, mothers taken violently, buried secretly, forgotten publicly, until Gary finally spoke. His confession revealed more than guilt. It revealed the terrifying truth that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles at you from across the street. Sometimes it's a man in work boots who nods hello in the grocery store. Gary Ridgway wore the mask of normalcy with perfection, and under it was something completely inhuman. The Green River Killer's story isn't just about murder. It's about deception, about a society that often looks past the vulnerable, about a predator who understood how to disappear in plain sight. His chilling truth is a reminder: monsters don't always live in the shadows. Sometimes they live next door,